Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. There's a mantra that you'll often hear among the networks of the National Council of Nonprofits. It goes like this: what's the problem? What are the solutions? Let's get them done. I share that mantra because it defines the work that has led to today's webinar, and it defines the webinar's purpose: identifying workable solutions and providing you the tools you need to get them done, to secure investments of the once-in-a-generation American Rescue Plan Act funds to help advance your missions in your local communities. Most of you on this webinar or watching on the recording are already familiar with the networks of the National Council of Nonprofits, the largest in the country. Much of the knowledge and experiences shared here today have come from the hands-on engagement of professionals at state associations of nonprofits. We've been talking to each other every day since before the pandemic fully erupted, and we continue to do so now to identify what the problems are for frontline nonprofits serving their local communities, to identify what solutions they've developed to continue serving people in those communities, and to identify ways to replicate those solutions in other parts of the country. Now, on today's webinar, we have a very full agenda with 10 speakers in total. All are focused on one point: our governments and our nonprofits work best when we all come together. Why? It's simple. We're serving the same constituents, the same people in the same communities, and we can achieve greater impact when we work together. If we all do our parts, then the opportunity given to us through the American Rescue Plan Act funds can be turned into real impact. Whatever your mission, we know that wise investment of the American Rescue Plan Act funds can change lives, transform communities, and build lasting relationships that will amplify this impact for years to come. Now, it's with that background that I'm delighted to introduce our honored guest speaker today, Mayor Svante Myrick. Anyone who knows his hometown of Ithaca, New York, knows it's a very special place. Mayor Myrick was first elected as mayor in 2012. And he's pulled local governments into the 21st century by embracing social media and expanding the city's web presence. He's revitalized the local economy, cleaned up the city, and made it a place where nonprofits are proud to operate. We've asked him to share with his personal story and his views on how local governments and nonprofits can partner together on behalf of their shared constituents. Mayor Myrick, the floor or the podium or the screen is now yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you all of you. It is a real pleasure to be with you virtually today. And this is my 10th year as mayor, and I know that a lot of my brothers and sisters in the fraternity of mayors might be alarmed that I'm here speaking on this topic. They'd say, what are you doing? Don't tell them how to get this money. So I want to tell you why it's important to me and why I am here. And it's because my whole life is a result of collective action. And it's part of why I really believe very deeply in the power of government to improve people's lives, because it happened to and for me. You know, I ended up getting elected mayor when I was 24 years old. I was elected to the city council when I was 20 years old and a junior at Cornell University. And all my two brothers, my sister, we all have gone on to live lives of purpose and satisfaction, even though where we started. So I was born in 1987 in the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. And my father was swept up in that epidemic and in the ensuing war on drugs, in and out of rehab, in and out of jail. And my mother was left alone with me and my siblings. And in fact, I was born into and raised the first 6 months of my life in a homeless shelter. You know, we came home from the hospital and found that all of our belongings were on the sidewalk, and that red eviction notice was on the door. And actually, for the first 8 years of my life, we were in and out of homelessness. But the power and the strength of a government that was wise enough to invest in things like a free public school and public education from well-paid public employee teachers who cared about me, cared about my siblings even when they didn't have to, made a huge difference. A free breakfast and free lunch meant that I could, focus on learning calculus instead of worrying about the rumble in my stomach. And here I stand, 17 years later, proud to say that I've not used calculus once in 17 years. Didn't need it. Important to learn it, I suppose, but and even going off to school, we all benefited from subsidized loans and grants from the state and federal government. And so that's why I went into government, because I believe, and I still believe, that we have the power to make people's lives better, easier, healthier, longer, stronger. But there was another part of my story, which is that homeless shelter, that first one we lived in, was not run by the state of Florida or by the city of Tampa, but by a nonprofit. And that the food pantry, when we moved here to New York State, the food pantry that we visited when we ran out of groceries was run by a nonprofit. That the tutoring service that helped me ace my SATs and get into Cornell was run by a nonprofit. And my experience in government so far has taught me that there's quite a lot the government can do, but it can do even more when it works in partnerships with nonprofits. And so I want to, if I could, just give you 3 quick bits of advice on how to approach either the chief executive or the legislatures when talking about these ARPA funds that will help from my experience. And so the first is to recognize that your governments are underfunded too, have been for at least 40 years. And these funds, will be guarded jealously, for a lot of our governments. I don't know if you know the parable of the cobbler's son, but the cobbler's son is always the one that goes barefoot. That is true for these governments. So just being aware of that, knowing that that there will be stiff competition from inside governmental operations is an important thing to know. But the second thing that I would stress is that nonprofits can do many things that governments cannot. Many of you do things that governments cannot. By virtue of what is beautiful about our system is that it's a representative democracy. And people are chosen from amongst the people and engage in a tense debate over the issues, and in this case, how best to use those resources. But what often happens in that debate is that the only thing government will fund, I'm speaking a little bit in generalities here, so excuse me, but the things that governments will fund are the things that are unequivocally backed up by hard data and can only be done by government. So the nonprofits are not going to pave streets, or provide policing services. And we know that the streets have to be paved. When there's an experimental program or something that we believe or something we have faith will work, it is much harder to get a government to fund those programs. So I would lean into that as you make your case and say, look, there are things you want to do, but you can't prove it's a good idea yet, right? Whether it's syringe exchanges or safe consumption sites, even the operation of homeless shelters and outreach services for people who have blown through their second chance. This is another thing governments aren't very good at, but is necessary if we are going to build a better America. Is, governments will give people a first chance, and some will give people a second chance. After that, I'm sure you've all seen it in terms of red tape and the benchmarks and how do we know we're not wasting money by investing in this person. But if we're going to lift up people do, because they're human, they need a third chance and a fifth chance and a seventh chance and a ninth chance. And particularly I've learned from our local faith-based organizations that there's often a zeal that comes from the nonprofit community that can reach and rescue those the government alone cannot do. So I would lean into that as a second point. And the third and final point is that there are a ton of traditional governmental operations, things we think of as a responsibility of government, that can actually be lifted up and supported better from outside of the governments than inside of it. And I'll just give you one quick example here because it's relevant to the times, but there are a ton of them. And that is about public safety. Whose responsibility is it to keep the community safe? Right? Now, if you ask that question, most people say, well, the police are who keep us safe, right? But public safety is about more, always has been about more than just policing. Right? In fact, it is mostly about more than just policing. And last year, for the first time, we had a real life example, a real life, almost like a laboratory experiment, but happening in the streets of America, of what happens when people feel insecure in their housing, what happens when people feel insecure in their employment, when they feel those social and emotional connections to each other fraying to the point of breaking. What happens is a crime wave. Right? Crime spiked all over America in 2021. I'll talk about here in Ithaca. Crime spiked in Ithaca in 2020, right? It was way above 2019 levels and way above 2021 levels so far. Crime is already back down so far in 2021. Well, what happened in 2020, right? Did we close the governments? Did we close police departments? Did we close sheriff's offices? No. In fact, they're just about the only things we kept open. We closed the nonprofits, we closed the schools, we closed the after-school programs, we closed a lot of the shelters. And what was the result was a community that was less safe. So if you approach your elected and appointed officials, if you make those cases, right, remembering first, they're broke too, so they're going to be protecting this money jealously, so tread, carefully and deftly. The second point, which is that there are things that you can do and chances you can take that governments cannot take. And then third, you can and do support the core functions of government, from public safety to infrastructure. I think if you make those cases, you'll be successful. And I want and need you to be successful because it's my belief that for all those little kids like me and for all those families, we need a strong and prosperous nonprofit civic sector, what they call in Europe the civil society, to make America what it should be, which is the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you, Mayor Myrick. That was incredible, inspirational. I think everyone on this call can tell your love and deep appreciation for the nonprofit sector and the work that everyone on this call does every day. So thank you for joining us. Feel free to stick around, answer questions at the end if you'd like. We really appreciate having you here. And what you were just saying, those 3 points, is exactly why we created this report that we're going to go over and why we are hosting this webinar, that we are here talking about exactly what you're saying, which is, how can we invest in our communities? How can we make the biggest impact possible with this federal funding that's coming down through the state and local government? So with that, we want to switch over to talking about this report with these great speakers that we have on hand for us. We broke this report down, the Strengthening State and Local Economies in Partnership with Nonprofits, to really talk about how government and nonprofits can work together to get things done and to build effective programs and make sure that those programs work. And so I want to take 1 second and emphasize that we are just talking about American Rescue Plan Act dollars through the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. So as our friends in Alaska, we're going to hear from someone in Alaska in a moment, they coined the acronym SISLFRF. It's really fun. I encourage everyone on this call to share it and use it. Say it again, SISLFRF. But we're just talking about those funds. So this is the $350 billion under the American Rescue Plan that will go to state and local governments specifically. This is the most flexible dollars. They can be used for all sorts of things. But there's a lot of other funding streams under American Rescue Plan. So specific for things like childcare or rental assistance. I think there's money for libraries. We're not going to talk about those specific CDBG alphabet soup issues. We're just talking about SISLFRF. So I wanted to make that very clear from the get-go. But we broke this down because we were hearing from government officials and from nonprofits, which is we want this money to make the biggest impact possible within their communities. They want it to go every dollar as far as it can to invest in their local economy and in their communities, which Mayor Myrick was just saying is extremely important so that everyone has a chance. And we want to be able to share what has worked. So, we broke it down into how can this money be used in partnership? What principles can governments use to create these funding streams? What recommendations should they consider whenever creating different programs? And then we used what we've learned through our network at the National Council of Nonprofits. The state associations have had all sorts of experience under previous federal funding to see what programs worked, what didn't work, what should be used, what shouldn't be used. And so our speakers are going to go into that as well. Things like unemployment costs, nonprofit grants and programs, government grants and contract streamlining, and expanding innovative solutions, which I like to call success stories in the nonprofit sector. So we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. Yes, the recording will be available afterwards. The slides will be available afterwards. So throw your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, we have a great lineup. I want to introduce, we have David L. Thompson, VP of Public Policy at the National Council of Nonprofits, Lori Wolf, President and CEO at the 4-Acre Group in Alaska, and David Heinen, VP for Public Policy and Advocacy at the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. They will be talking about the Building Effective Programs. And then the second part will be covering programs that work. So these success stories that we like to talk about. Danielle Clore, the CEO at the Kentucky Nonprofit Network, Liz Moore, Executive Director at the Montana Nonprofit Association, Chai Jean-Dorsarat, I practiced that, VP for Public Policy and Nonprofit New York, and Denise Harlow, CEO Community Action Partnership. So with that, I turn it over to David Thompson. We do have the most important question for you, which is, can governments provide grants and hire nonprofits using CISL-FIRF?
One word, yes. Back to you. Okay, 2 words. Let me do more than one word, but I will be brief. This is a question that we've gotten from governors' offices. We can't really provide funding for nonprofits, can we? And the answer is absolutely yes. And let me tell you, yes, and yes, in that the statute itself, the CISL-FIRF part, the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, the $350 billion bucket of money we're talking about, expressly says that the money can be used by state, local, tribal, territorial governments at all levels to provide, quote, assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits. That and nonprofits is in bold and we're shouting it, close quote. It's to be very abundantly clear. And the Treasury Department has put out regulations and interim final rule and frequently asked questions to define that. So the assistance, that part of the statute, the assistance they're talking about is things to support grants to nonprofits to support payroll and mortgage and job training and personal protection equipment, a lot of the questions that we've received already. So it's the yes, governments can provide assistance directly to nonprofits because of the pandemic, to help you get over the bump, get over the hump, to survive and continue operations, similar to small businesses and households. And this is very, very important, and I hope you'll remember it as we go through the rest of the program, because there's a lot more to it. And this is what Mayor Myrick was speaking to. Nonprofits do provide services in communities. We're not just receiving support, assistance to keep ourselves going, but it's to provide, the governments can provide nonprofits with funding, with contracts, with grants, to provide assistance, to provide services, to provide assistance to other people. The rule of, and that by that I mean things like food assistance, housing, counseling, job training, and the whole gamut, emergency assistance, eviction support, things like that. The rule of thumb is that if the government can use these funds for themselves, and Mayor Myrick spoke to this very eloquently, I was thrilled and wrote copious notes there. If they can use these funds for themselves, they can use these funds better by hiring nonprofits to provide these services. So yes, they can provide these, they can use these funds to support nonprofits, to provide assistance to nonprofits, and to hire nonprofits to provide assistance to others. That's can they. Will they is the rest of, is everyone else's part of the program. Will they and how to and so forth. So I turn it back to you, Tiffany, to share, to move us on.
Thank you, David. Next up, we have Lori Wolf of the 4 Acre Group in Alaska, the founder and noted impetus of the word SISLFR. So she's going to share principles that governments can follow to spend the ARPA SISLFR funds wisely and effectively.
Given my credit to my board member, but thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure today to share some concepts with you that we believe that governments could use to guide their decision-making process in identifying spending programs that could have the greatest impact in our communities across the country. This report from the National Council of Nonprofits relied heavily on the experiences of both Alaska, and we're grateful for that, but also many other state association success experiences during the CARES distribution of funding. With that, they use that to draft these principles and recommendations. I would say I'm going to share with you those, but in addition to Mayor Myrick's wonderful positioning points as well. If you combine those, I think we're in good position. While we encourage states to have strategies that speak directly to the people and communities of your own state, we strongly encourage you to use these 4 criteria with your conversations with government at all levels to help them determine the best path forward with their spending. So with that, I'm going to introduce the 4 ideas. So the first is to prioritize equity from the onset. The pandemic, for sure, has laid bare many of what we already knew, or what so many knew, which is that the inequities in access to funding, time, resources, and capital is vast and deep. Placing equity at the center will require new steps for most government entities, and we know that every step is worth it, and we know that it will improve lives in the communities we all live in. We strongly encourage governments, and we strongly encourage you to encourage governments at all levels to apply the lessons learned throughout the pandemic to end the systemic inequities rooted in our systems. That's 1. 2 is to invest in economic multipliers. So quite frankly, we know that investing in nonprofits help fuel economic recovery and drive economies across this nation. You heard some examples just already today. Nonprofits promote healthy local economies by employing people directly. And fun fact, we're the 2nd largest employer in the country. Fun fact, in Alaska, we're 17% of the workforce as well. And we provide essential services like helping people get back to work by providing childcare and job training and stable housing and food. We also know, for example, that arts and cultural institutions, for example, are an economic multiplier in their ability to spur spending in restaurants and shops and even paid parking. In Alaska, we have encouraged nonprofits to do their math, and we encourage every nonprofit across the country to do their math so that each of you is ready to talk about the multiplying economic impact that every investment that is made through you can have across your communities. Number 3, implementing the funding quickly and yet fairly. And I already see in the chat bar questions like, when will the money be available? And that is a wonderful question that every government is grappling with across the country. So we all know we need this money fast. We know we also want it to be fair. So governments should push funding out quickly to meet urgent needs, but also to do it fairly by spreading opportunities beyond the usual recipients. So we have success already with CARES to see governments partnering with local funding intermediaries in your region who are already set up to be grant makers and can work alongside other partners like our state associations to assess the needs on the ground and deploy resources both strategically, equitably, and quickly. And again, lots of great examples, and you're going to hear some of those later today. Number 4, to maintain accountability via reasonable documentation and transparency. Of course, the nonprofit sector, we all know, we have many safeguards in place, and we already have oversight in place. And we simply don't have time or capacity for redundancy. So we are encouraging governments to learn what compliance measures are already in place, and you can help them by letting them know what those pieces are, and then to apply appropriate safeguards and disclosure requirements to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse. We know, for example, that groups are not applying for funds because they are afraid of the compliance factors that are being laid on top of compliance that already exists. And we don't want nonprofits and our communities to not to be afraid of the funding that is potentially in front of them. And we know, of course, that when there is waste, what hurts one of us will hurt all of us in terms of trust and credibility in our sector. So we encourage the safeguards, but we don't want them to be redundant. So we know nonprofits across the country are positioned to take on all of these criteria. We know that we're positioned well, thanks to Mayor Myrick's comments as well. And we just encourage all of you to find those good partners and have those good conversations so that we can find those partnerships. And with that, Tiffany, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Lori. I think that shows the breadth and knowledge of the sector and this network, and knowing what's worked and what hasn't worked and how government should frame this. I did see in the Q&A some questions about CISLFIRF, so I wanted to spell that out very clearly once again. It is the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. So if you take the first letter of all that, the acronym is CISLFIRF, and this is the $350 billion, the most flexible money out of the American Rescue Plan that is going directly to state and local governments and should be partnering with nonprofits to invest in their communities. So just so that we're very, very clear on what we're talking about. And next up, we have David Heinen at North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. They have some recommendations on how governments can set up these different types of programs. And I really think a lot of you should be taking notes at this point, because this is what you can bring to those state and local governments to explain why they should be investing in governments or in nonprofits and how these partnerships will go forward. So David?
Hey, thanks, Tiffany. The 4 principles that Lori just described were a great kind of overview of the big picture questions about prioritizing investments. So now, like Tiffany just said, I'm going to kind of get into real quickly what a program can look like. So kind of what some of those considerations are and how to develop a program. So talking about a few specific recommendations. And the good news is that there's already a model for this, because many states and some local governments created similar programs using funding from the CARES Act last year, and that provides a great template to use. So in North Carolina, we didn't have that, but what we've done is we've talked to hundreds of nonprofits and developed some state-specific recommendations based on some of the specific feedback that nonprofits have had about how ARP funds can be used and what the needs are. But each state can really tailor these recommendations and the ones that are listed in the special report to their own needs. But so we're just going to talk now just kind of briefly about some of the universal factors that state associations have seen. And those are eligibility criteria, allowable uses of funds, program administration, application requirements, prioritization, kind of talking about some of the factors that Lori just mentioned, grant amounts, budget surpluses, kind of looking at, as many states like North Carolina have, and some local governments perhaps, in addition to ARP funds, have more funding available than usual because of revenue surpluses in the last couple of years. And then communication of opportunities. Most of these are really common sense practices designed to help clarify that all 501c3 nonprofits are included and are eligible to apply for funding support. So just to elaborate on a few of them, as far as eligibility criteria, we know that different types of nonprofits have been impacted in very different ways by the pandemic. So it's important for the state and local governments to recognize this by creating a broad range of eligibility criteria, things like revenue losses, but also increase in demand for programs and services, or increase in expenses, or loss of volunteers, which is really kind of something that's unique to nonprofits. It's been a real impact of the pandemic. As far as allowable uses, ideally it would be used for general operating support. I think every nonprofit knows that the general operating support are 3 words that we love to see. In some cases, maybe governments can't or are a little bit unwilling to go quite that broad. But regardless, I think it's really important to allow as broad as possible a set of permissible uses for nonprofits from this fund. In the special report, we make the case that the government should appoint program administrators. And that could be a government agency, or it could be some other type of third-party intermediary, maybe a community foundation, another nonprofit, some other type of foundation, with prior experience and relationships with nonprofits, so that it's not some type of intermediary that just is unfamiliar with how to work with nonprofits. Recommendations also encourage governments to use simple, clear, and easy to understand application forms. Last thing nonprofits need is more red tape, or as we in the State Association Network like to put it, that complexification really takes away from nonprofits' ability to serve their communities. Reiterating something that Lori mentioned when she was describing the principles earlier, it's really critical that governments design their programs to be as inclusive as possible, to expand the pool of who's receiving funds, who is partnering with government. It's a great opportunity to really bring inclusiveness into the process. And then finally, using budget surpluses can really make it help magnify the impact of ARP funds on communities. So just as an example, from here in North Carolina, we've got a huge budget surplus, and right now we're right in the middle of our state budget process. Yes, we're a little bit slow in doing things in the South, and state legislators are looking at ways to bolster the ARP funds that we've received at the state level by looking at other available funds. So there's a lot of money in the savings reserve, and also a huge budget surplus for the last couple of years, and actually through yesterday with the latest revenue forecast that we received at the state level. So they're really looking at ways to kind of bring all that money together and magnify the impact on communities. And finally, it's really important to ensure that there are clear, regular, timely, and broadly distributed communications throughout the entire process.
Thanks, David. So that is the beginning of how to build these effective programs and how to go to your government agencies, your executives, your legislators, and say, this is how we should be using these funds, and this is how you can partner with nonprofits to invest in your communities. Now we're going to turn to what I think is my favorite part of the report, which is these success stories and things that you can actually use these funds for. So I want to start with Danielle Clora, the Kentucky Nonprofit Network. We're going to talk about the unbelievable costs of unemployment and benefits, things that people don't think about. So Danielle, over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone on the webinar today. We know in Kentucky, and certainly in every state, economic recovery is dependent on bringing people back to work and removing the heavy burden of unemployment costs that are still weighing down some nonprofits is keying to allow those same nonprofits to rehire and bring in new workers to meet ongoing community needs. Unemployment costs skyrocketed during the pandemic, but some employers suffered the consequences of it more than others because of the way their unemployment system is set up. Not to get too much into the weeds, but most employers fall into a contributing employer bucket. They pay into their state's unemployment system, and for the most part, they've been held harmless throughout the pandemic for these charges. Others, particularly religious institutions or very small nonprofits, were and remain exempt from unemployment costs, even though their laid off employees did receive benefits. The third kind, which only affects nonprofit and government employers, are what are called reimbursing employers. These employers self-insure or reimburse the state for the actual costs for benefits paid when someone is laid off or furloughed. Normally, this makes wonderful financial sense for nonprofits because nonprofits have low turnover, it keeps our costs down, and ultimately it means we aren't diverting scarce resources to subsidize the employment practices of other employers. But under CARES and the American Rescue Plan Act, the federal government only covered a portion of these costs, unlike for contributing employers whose costs were covered completely. Right now, reimbursing employers in most states are still on the hook for 25% of these charges. Last year, some states, like Kentucky, covered the portion of costs that the federal government didn't cover, so reimbursing employers weren't left hanging. Kentucky Nonprofit Network, on behalf of our members, was able to work directly with our governor's office to secure over $51 million for the state's unemployment trust fund to cover these costs last year. The administration recognized the essential role of nonprofits, not just as service providers, but also as essential to Kentucky's recovery and our economy. We're the 4th largest employer in the Commonwealth. And we continue to be in talks with the executive and legislative branches to cover the costs for 2021 using American Rescue Plan Act funds. Other states provided additional support to employers by providing retroactive relief and shoring up their trust funds, both permitted under the American Rescue Plan Act. We encourage more states to act and ensure all employers, nonprofits, for-profits, contributing and reimbursing employers alike are fully covered and held harmless from the unemployment costs that have been caused by the pandemic. Tiffany, back to you.
Thanks, Danielle. I know that's a little weedy for some of the people on the call, but it is an easy way that governments can put money into something that will affect nonprofits as employers. So thanks for covering that. Next up, this might be the easiest form of funding that nonprofits, you on the call, can actually access depending on your state or locality. We learned a lot under the CARES Act on how to set up these funds. So I turn it over to Liz Moore at the Montana Nonprofit Association to talk about nonprofit relief funds and grant programs.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the National Council of Nonprofits for continuing to do a stellar job of pulling information from the grassroots so that all of us can take advantage of what others know. So thank you. I'm going to talk about grants programs, and there are differences in every state with how grants programs with the original CARES money and now ARPA are being handled. So I'm going to try to cover both of those, and it's a little bit of a stretch, but I'm going to give it a try. So the most common and really straightforward way that governments have partnered with nonprofits in the past 18 months has been through grants programs. And so we think those are the most successful models, even though not every state has that kind of a structure. It's really helpful if there's just a go-to place where you can have clear eligibility criteria and access funding easily. So the first grant program set up last year was a $60 million nonprofit emergency relief fund in New Hampshire. And then dozens of other states followed suit and created different kinds of programs. Some of them turned to nonprofits to administer those programs. Some used state administration portals, and then others used kind of third-party intermediaries. Some were created by executive authorities, some by legislators, again, depending on what your particular state government, their take on the funding mechanisms. So the key really seemed to be whether those who were administering the funds really accurately understood the role nonprofits play in relief and recovery. And to the degree that state administrators understood that, they got out of the way, created more quick access, barrier-free access to funding. And so that's where having those relationships already in place made a huge difference. I can speak for our state. One of the things we did often during COVID was provide snapshot pulse poll or survey results to state administration so that we were in front of them. So they were remembering who we were, and we ended up being, able to help craft the language for nonprofits to have funding available to them as partners in government. And but some of that was because we were a resource to government in as they put all of that together. And in Montana, the Department of Commerce administered 30 different grants programs, somewhere around almost $800 million. It went for nonprofits, small business, a variety of places. But there was a social services grants program that ended up dispensing 55 million in grant funds pretty readily. And so that, that was pretty successful and made the difference to a lot of nonprofits, along with PPP and those other sources of funding. So this year for us and many other states, it feels a little more obscure, and the relief funds are, massive, and everyone wants to be in line for them. So it's a little bit harder to figure out how to make it all work. So I just wrote some notes about what we've done at M&A and what I've heard from other state associations. So first of all, create a work plan. Just start with where we are and create a work plan that evaluates what are the existing relationships, what do we know, who do we know that can help introduce us to new relationships. In our case, there are many new relationships because we moved from a Democrat governor to a Republican governor and administration. And so those are all new relationships. We've had to ask for entree, and we have called on everyone possible, whether it's legislators, members of staff teams, board members. All of those relationships have been important. And at the local level, our relationships with the League of Cities and Counties and with the Montana Association of Counties, or MACO, has been critical. And then seeking information. Some states, Alaska has an outstanding website. I like how Montana's website has evolved. And so, but in other states I've looked and it's less centralized information, but seeking information. And some of that may come through the state government website and public meeting forums and things like that, understanding the broad priorities. So that has helped us this year. Some of the ARPA funds will be broadly available to nonprofits. Others are much more geared to specific interests where it will be harder for nonprofits. And then getting people in front of our people. So just as the National Council of Nonprofits is doing right now, we, for example, have a webinar with some of the leaders in state government who are involved with how ARPA decisions are made. And we are doing our own webinar so that partly so our people have a chance to ask questions, if you will, our people, but also because we want those folks to be thinking about nonprofits and the role of nonprofits as they make decisions about funding. And then we've requested non-exclusive language, and we continue to do this as commissions meet, as meetings happen with public officials. We simply ask that there be no language put into eligibility criteria that it would expressly exclude a nonprofit structure. And then, as David Heinen said, just paying attention to 2 years down the road. We're thinking about anything that's being backfilled right now with ARPA funds, for example. We need to really be paying attention to what's going to happen if there is a cliff in a couple of years. Right now, the budgets are flush, but that could change. So grant programs have been a lifeline for nonprofits, and your advocacy and the advocacy of the state associations has been invaluable in that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Reaching out to the state association or to others who have been involved, these principles are sound now just as they were last year. I would say make a plan today for your next steps, that you don't have to have the whole answer and there isn't one magic answer. Just start with where you are and make a plan for how you're going to advance the ball down the field in the coming week and then months ahead. Tiffany, back to you.
Thanks, Liz. And those are all, perfect examples of how you can access these funds. And so highly encourage you to reach out to your state association. That should be your first stop on whether these resources, programs have been set up, how to advocate to create these programs. That's where you can go to start the ball rolling. So now we want to turn to a subject area that might not be as intuitive as a simple grant program. Not that grant programs are always simple, but something that is a perennial issue in the nonprofit sector, which is streamlining grants and contracts. I want to turn it over to Chai Jindasarat at the nonprofit in New York to talk about correcting this process and actually getting funding under the process. Chai?
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and hi, everyone. My name is Chai Jidaswarat. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm joining you today from Nonprofit New York, which is in New York City. And I also want to echo the thanks to the National Council of Nonprofits and my fellow co-panelists. A lot of what I'll be talking about is building upon the work and the recommendations that my other panelists have shared in terms of establishing the kinds of relationships with government so that we can really dig into the details. So I'm going to go a little bit weedy, and it'll be fun. So in New York City, we actually had a pretty significant challenge with indirect cost rates. And about 5 years ago, one of our very, very large nonprofits that the city relied on to provide major services for thousands of New Yorkers went under. And when they did an audit of what was happening, a lot of the assessment was that the indirect cost rates for the organization were underfunded by the government. And so when I say indirect cost rates, I'm talking about those shared costs that every organization has that are essential and required for operating, but you may not be able to directly attribute it to a particular grant program, or it may share, it may support multiple different government grants. And one of the things that, so for example, things like accounting, technology, rent, and one of the things that was going on in New York was that every city agency, and we have literally dozens and dozens, or maybe even hundreds, honestly, at the city level, they all had different policies and different rates and different caps for what an indirect cost rate could be. And so organizations, it was a huge administrative burden, and they were having to backfill it with their fundraising, with philanthropic dollars. And so it still exists. There's a committee under the current administration called the Nonprofit Resiliency Committee that really elevated this as a major issue, and building upon, decades of research about this and how measuring a nonprofit's indirect cost rate versus their direct cost rate actually isn't the best tool for leading to outcomes. But financially, it's really, really important. And so the city, the Mayor's Office of Management and Budget, the City Council, the Nonprofit Resiliency Committee, with a very robust group of nonprofits through the Nonprofit Resiliency Committee, worked to right-size and standardize their indirect cost rates and create a new cost manual where it's just much easier and much clearer what costs are able to be allocated for indirect cost rates and what that process is and what rates will be honored, building on the federal OMBs. One other thing I will mention is that there's a lot of, when you get into kind of peeling the onion of contracting, there's a ton of issues that you can look at. So not only were our indirect cost rates not standard, but also the pay for some of our workforce was for the exact same position, if it was funded by the government and it was a nonprofit worker, was significantly lower, sometimes $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 less for the exact same position, providing the exact same service, but one was funded by the government, or one was directly working for the government and one was nonprofit. So that's another issue that a lot of our sectors are looking at in terms of government contracting. The other thing I will lift up is that, like many states in 2020, our revenue across the state was significantly down. The governor issued an executive order that suspended our prompt payment laws and authorized government agencies to withhold up to 20% of the amounts owed to nonprofits during the pandemic. It was really, really concerning. A lot of staff had to be let go. Many organizations were considering closing, programs were shut down. Fortunately, ARPA came right at the right time before the timing of our state budget, so that our contracts were able to be restored. They were moved to 5%, and then now they're fully restored. So we know New York is not alone. We've seen similar problems and other types of strains on government grants and contracts in states with successes like California, Colorado, Connecticut, New Jersey, providing more flexibility during the pandemic. So we encourage all states to do that. So I think I will close there and just really stress that governments really can use these ARPA funds to pay their bills for services already rendered on their behalf and cover the full cost of what it takes. So please take advantage of this opportunity to fix a lot of these longstanding problems that we know exist. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Chai. And I saw in the Q&A, there's some requests for some of your resources about streamlining. So we'll definitely get those out, or feel free to put a link in the chat box there as well. So our final speaker, Denise Harlow of the Community Action Partnership, the national office. This is really the meat of where you can go. We encourage you to listen to her stories about, these success stories about what nonprofits can do with this funding, and to dream big and think about how this can, really affect your communities, what you need on the ground as nonprofits. So Denise, take it away.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you to the National Council of Nonprofits for this chance to talk with folks today. Exactly right, Tiffany. Think big, think creatively. The recommendations from our colleagues around today's table make a lot of sense. Governments need to hear from you. You need to be in front of people talking about the value that you're bringing to the table and the ideas and creative juices that are flowing through your organization. Funders love to say fund what works, right? We know what works in the nonprofit sector. Nonprofits work. Your work every day is leveraging. You heard Tim earlier talk about those multipliers. That could not be more true during the CARES Act funding that the National Community Action Network received. There was about $1 billion of the Community Services Block Grant, but our network of nonprofits also leveraged the rental assistance money, a variety of other governmental money to be creative, to deploy services, to pivot in new ways to use technology. And we have several reports up on our website that would hopefully provide ideas, support, guidance to nonprofits all across this country. I also want to just highlight that the possibility in rural America with these dollars that really hasn't been touched on here yet. So often we talk about flyover country. These dollars, the amount of money going into some rural communities is significant. Nonprofits, you have a real role to play, rural, urban, suburban, frontier across America to make the case that you work in your local community. You are the trusted partners. That's another critical message that we found in community action to be true during this period of time. We saw that state governments needed to deploy rental assistance dollars. We were able to navigate our network of community action agencies within a state, and when the monies flowed through that network, things became efficient, things became effective, and dollars were able to flow. I think of examples such as Everyone Eats in Vermont, which was the community action agencies partnered with local businesses, with state government, but partnered primarily with local businesses to purchase meals from local businesses to give to folks who needed meals. You talk about a multiplier effect to sustain local businesses. We had a community action agency in Virginia who was able to do a small business loan program using some CARES funding, right? We've had agencies do a lot of food distribution, rental assistance, utility assistance, water assistance. And many of you who are working directly with families understand painfully how complicated it can be when folks need to rely on a governmental system for paperwork and processing and uploading of information. Think about the current rental assistance pot, right? How can you as local providers access these dollars to be the easy access for families who have multiple barriers to accessing programs and services? And during this time of COVID, the community action agencies have been able to do that. I think of Ohio, where they've leveraged $700 million of state rental money that was, I don't want to say floundering, but I know that when it went through the nonprofit network in Ohio, it was effective, it was efficient, it got out the door and kept people housed. We have examples like that in Wisconsin, in Maine, in Virginia, in many places, and similar examples in Kentucky and Tennessee and Maryland around utility assistance. And we know that there are these dollars out there, but in nonprofits, you know the challenges that real families face to access those dollars. So I encourage you to, I was talking with one of my colleagues in community action. He said, Denise, this is the most dramatic moment in our career for these dollars coming into local communities. And we need nonprofits to step into this space, make the argument to local officials to fund what works. And by the way, nonprofit, we are the network that truly works across America. One last piece before I turn it back to Tiffany. The child tax credit. We all know the impact this is going to have on poverty in America, specifically on children's poverty in America. You also know those families who need it the most are really challenged by the accessibility of a non-filer tool and things like that? What can you do to try to work with government to take some of maybe of these funds to help assist families to access those resources that will help stabilize them for the long term? Think creative, think big, you know what works, and take action. Tiffany, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Denise. That was inspirational. And we absolutely agree. And I know we can get into some of these, some of the points that you mentioned, but I did want to open it up to some questions and answers at this time for all of the speakers. Don't know if Mayor Myrick's still on hand. If so, please feel free to join us and jump in, share your knowledge and expertise from the government side. But I want to start with, so just, you know, we had over 100 questions before we even started this. So we will try to get through as many as possible. Hello, Mayor Myrick. Thank you for joining us again. You know, I wanted to start with you. You know, now that you've heard kind of some of these stories and examples that we've shared, you know, or do you think you're more likely to partner with nonprofits? Where should nonprofits go? You know, if they need to pick up the phone right now, like who's the first person they should call?
Yeah, and, well, first, yes, I'm more likely now, and I'll say an hour ago I was pretty likely. So good job. And I think, so I'm biased, right? To ask a mayor where to start. Start with the mayor, because mayors both have the eagle's eye view of what the community needs, but they're also the first mover often in these negotiations. And that's what this is going to be. It's a negotiation with the legislative bodies. So whoever your respective executive is, whether it's a county executive or mayor, or even your state executive, the governor's office, they are going to be the first movers in these negotiations. They put a proposal in front of the legislatures, the city council, county state legislatures, that those ledges will react to. And it is much harder, in my experience, if your funding is included in that proposal, it's hard for a legislature to take it out, especially if you can maintain that pressure. And the opposite is true. If it's not included in that first move from the executive, it is harder for legislatures to add it in, often because it will mean taking funding away from something else. So that's my advice, but you asked a mayor, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. That would be my advice. Get in with the executive and make a case again about, you know, figuring out what are their top 3 priorities, say, for the next year. How can your nonprofit help them achieve those? If it's housing, security, if it's public safety, even if it's infrastructure, finding a way to make the case that you can help them.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, and then I'm going to turn to maybe Liz and Lori, because you also have a lot of small rural nonprofits. But Denise was just mentioning how a lot of these small nonprofits feel like they were left out in different areas, either through access, just because they didn't know about it, knowledge, resources, relationships. So, you know, what is available to specifically small nonprofits under these American Rescue Plan, Fiscal for funds? Mayor?
Well, I would say first that with rare exceptions, most of this money will not have already been allocated, in part because the funds are actually coming to municipalities in particular in 2 separate slices. So one this year and one next year. So I would just stay in there and continue to advocate. I'm finding especially that counties have been a bit, this is not going to be true everywhere, but counties have been a bit slower than cities in figuring out where they're going to spend those funds. So if your municipality either didn't get a lot of money because it's fairly small, or if your municipality already has a plan set, try shifting towards the county.
Tiffany, I would echo that. And I think that the funding that is going to cities and counties, at least in a really rural state, we have, in a way, a lot better chance of working locally to gain access to funds than we do with the big state money that's allocated by the legislature. And so I think those relationships with city and county commissions are super important. Also, there are some pots of funding that require community planning. So housing is one of those, you know, and so To the degree that nonprofits can be in advocating to be part of a community planning process where there's a dialogue between business, government, and nonprofits, that's going to be helpful as well.
Tiffany, this is Lori in Alaska. I'll say we don't have a county system of government in Alaska, so we get to go directly to our local governments through and also our borough governments, and then at the state level as well. We also have, I would encourage, we haven't talked about partnering with our tribal governments on this call, but I strongly encourage that. We have excellent examples of partnerships all over Alaska with our tribes, between tribes and nonprofits, and just strongly encourage you to think about that. Tribes are receiving their own tranches of ARPA relief dollars, in addition to the dollars that are flowing directly to the Western forms of government in our state. So just encourage and shout out to partnering with tribes, especially on major issues like water and broadband, and some of those larger issues that have also very specific funding coming through. So we were talking about CISL-FERF, which is this unrestricted money to some degree, which has some caveats. It's not completely unrestricted, but we're also talking about, and I think we all need to remember that there's a lot of different trails of funding coming through ARPA. And I asked Tiffany to share our Alaska website, which is open and available to everyone that's trying to track all the different kinds of money. But I do think when we talk about the small organizations, we have seen really amazing examples of some public-private partnerships with money in CARES, especially around housing and rental relief, using teeny nonprofits that are on the ground in community, being that sort of access point. We heard Denise talk about that. And we've also seen wonderful success with our community foundations being the distributors of funding of state and federal and local government funding as well. So lots of really good examples of partnerships all the way around.
Thanks, Lori. I wanted to ask David Heinen and Danielle, we had a couple unemployment insurance questions come in. If a nonprofit hasn't received an unemployment bill from the state, should they be concerned at this stage? David?
Yeah, it depends. I think it depends on what the state's process is and what the state is doing. I know in North Carolina, nonprofits didn't receive bills. The state is covering the portion for reimbursing nonprofits. Danielle did a nice job earlier of describing the different ways that nonprofits provide unemployment coverage for their workers. For reimbursing nonprofits in North Carolina, and I know many other states did this, the states are covering the portion of those expenses that the federal government doesn't cover under the CARES Act and then the subsequent federal laws. North Carolina, in doing that, what they did is that they, our state unemployment agency provided notice on their website that they wouldn't be sending bills to nonprofits, but that they would be sending them just a notice of what the charges would be, but with a clear statement on them that they don't have to pay that. But I think every state, my understanding is that every state is handling it differently. So, it's probably best to check with your state nonprofit association, who might have some good contacts and some good insights there. So don't know what state was asking that, but generally, probably each state nonprofit association has a good handle on what's going on in their state.
Danielle, anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is in Kentucky, and I don't think we were unique, we had a really antiquated system for processing claims and tracking all of this. And so when there was a delay in Kentucky, it wasn't necessarily anything to get alarmed about. It was folks trying to figure things out, honestly. So I think David's advice is spot on. Hopefully the state association has a handle on kind of the bigger picture with what's going on, because I know, again, in Kentucky, those folks are incredibly overwhelmed trying to process claims. And, people were saying, I can't get any answers. And so we were able to say to our unemployment officials, we want to get this information out on behalf of the sector, and we're able to get some information more quickly about when invoices could be expected and those kinds of things. But especially in the early days, and honestly still at this point, they're still in many ways trying to figure things out with softwares and systems and guidance from the feds. And so I wouldn't necessarily be too alarmed, but recognizing that things are still fluid, even, a year and a half later.
Thank you. Mayor Myrick and Chai, this is a good question for both of you. How can nonprofits improve government's understanding of the importance of staffing costs in delivering programs that help the community recover? Mayor Myrick?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And governments have the same problem too, is that, folks want services, but they're like, we want to fund the program. And it's like, well, who would you like to do the program? Like, well, I don't know, your staff. It's like, well, we have to pay those staff. Like, we don't want to fund the paying of the staff. No, we just want to fund the program. And government leaders, smart ones, should understand, like for our budget, for example, even in a municipality, which has a lot of heavy, hard infrastructure and police cars and fire cars and DPW trucks, still for us, about 75% of our costs are personnel. Nothing works better than people telling their own story, in my experience. So when you go in for meetings and also those council meetings or hearings, bringing your staff along so that they can see their faces, allowing your staff to speak. So it's more than just the executive director, letting them share their stories, what brought them to the work. It's really powerful to hear somebody say, I've been working in housing services for the last 6 years. These are the kind of, this is my client base. This is who I help. This is what I think about when I go home at night. Putting a human face on not just the recipients of the funds, but the actual service providers should help.
Yeah, I would say, just to reiterate what Mayor Myrick said in his opening remarks about data, that can be really helpful. I know it can be tough, but I have seen a lot of success where a program really used data to show how important it was to not only provide the funding to staff up the program, but also that sometimes the funding wasn't enough. And so I'm thinking specifically about when I worked at OMB, I worked on the city budget. What part of my portfolio was child welfare and preventive services. New York State has invested a lot in preventative services for foster care, and that's great because we've actually seen the census for foster youth go down significantly over the past 10 to 15 years. But a few years ago, the city invested a lot in adding a lot of new slots. We called them slots, but I know that's a weird term, but we called them like slots for like families to be served. But the nonprofits who were running the programs were saying we can't hire, like we can't actually serve that many slots because we can't hire for them. And they had really clear data on that. We looked at wages across the sector, comparable positions, and we were able to basically add funding for that through that data. I know that can be sometimes a tough process, but the numbers really spoke for themselves.
Thank you. So I think there's one more question. There's been a lot of questions on this in the chat, so I feel remiss if I don't hit on it, which is how can philanthropy help, or what role can foundations play? I'm going to turn that over to Lori, and then we'll turn it to Tim to close with the last 5 minutes.
I think philanthropy has a couple of roles here. One is our community foundations and other funding intermediaries like United Ways can be a vehicle to deliver ARPA funds like they did with CARES funds. They're set up to be grant makers. They're set up for compliance. They're set up to do all those things. There's no reason why we can't see that working again with ARPA funds. So that's on one side. On the other side, I would say private philanthropy to look for the gaps. ARPA funds can't do it all. I see on the chat, like lots of people want to build buildings and do remarkable things, and philanthropy will have to be a complement to that. And so to looking for ways to find that complement.
Thank you, Lori. And with that, Tim, CEO of the National Council of Nonprofits, any closing remarks?
Yes, thanks, Tiffany. And on behalf of the audience from coast to coast and border to border, I want to thank our speakers here today for sharing their knowledge, their insights, their experience, and their passion. Thank you all. I want to highlight a gift that was given to us during this webinar. And that was the honest observation from Mayor Myrick. And it's that governments are hungry too. Governments have been starved for the last 40 years. And what too many Americans are not aware of, and too many nonprofits are not aware of, is when governments have to slash their budgets, it shifts the work onto the backs of charitable nonprofits. And we start providing even more services. And we don't have taxing power. We just have our hearts and our backs, and we throw both of them into it. But at a certain point in time, everything breaks. And we need to recognize as we go in to talk to our friends at the state and local levels, as well as tribal governments, that they have been starving, that we are competing. It's not that they're trying to hurt us. They may not understand the important role that we all play. And so we have an education game that we must play. Please also recognize you all are angels. You're doing the work of angels. You are superpowers. You're doing wonderful things. But the rest of government doesn't see that. They don't recognize that. When you go to Congress and just look at all the relief legislation that came out, the CARES Act, the ARPA Act, and other things, governments didn't just include nonprofits. That was hardcore collective action by the nonprofit community to lift our voices and be heard. And that's why we need to recognize that there's power in numbers. And that's why I encourage you to join your state association of nonprofits, because when you join them, you can help be part of that voice, but you could also be gathering information from them. A lot of the comments in the Q&A today were people saying, where do I get this information? If you join your state association, you will have access to a lot of this information. The second thing I want to reinforce is why we pulled this together. This is, for anyone who got a degree in political science, this is poli-sci 101 federalism. This is us coming together and discovering what works and what doesn't work in different states, in different cities, and different counties, and then using that through the National Council of Nonprofits. We're then able to take that information and transport it across state lines. So the people in Florida are learning from the people in Alaska. And then I'll just close with this observation. And that is, I've worked for government. I've volunteered for government as members of boards and commissions. I've worked for charitable nonprofits. I've volunteered for the charitable nonprofits. From all those vantage points, I have seen that nonprofits and governments are serving the same people in the same communities. We could have a much greater impact in advancing everybody's mission and improving everybody's life if we work together hand in hand with our government partners, and our government partners meet us halfway so that they're partnering with us, because together we can. With that, I want to give a special shout out to Tiffany, thanking her for keeping us online and on time. Job extremely well done. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know if we have one last slide, but we do encourage you to connect with us. You can sign up for our newsletters on councilofnonprofits.org/connect, and you can find the report at councilofnonprofits.org/ARPA, ARPA. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day.